Okay, so we can start our session of the PROTEUS seminar series. Today we have J.P. Shank. He is a professor at the University of Minnesota at Minneapolis. And he will talk about the complexities of cosmological time in pre-modern Europe. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for the invitation, and to all of you for attending. As I explained to Sylvia, you can all hear me fine? I'm speaking clearly? Yeah, okay. As I explained to Sylvia, I'm embarking on a very new research project. It's not new. I've written 2 books about the reception in continental Europe of Isaac Newton's physics and mathematics, focusing more on mechanics and analytical mechanics and sort of the history of calculus-based physics. So not necessarily the cosmological dimension of Newton. So this is, in a sense, an extension of that. But it's new in the sense that I'm expanding, as you'll see, far beyond Newton. And in that first book, The Newton Wars and the Beginning of the French Enlightenment, which was my first book, the first title of it, the first chapter is titled Provincializing Europe. Or sorry, Provincializing Newton. It's taken from the post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarty's idea of provincializing Europe. And so that project was trying to provincialize Newton, by which I mean to sort of, rather than make him a singular iconic figure, to instead embed him more fully in the broader history of Europe and science in this way. In many ways, this next project is provincializing cosmological science. It's trying to understand it not as the result of a sort of great leap forward in history or a kind of break into the modern, but as a much more complex set of things. And I'm just beginning with this. So what I'm going to present to you here is not a formal paper. I have no sort of thesis I want to argue. Rather, I'm going to try to summarize what I've done so far and show you the questions I'm asking and the way I'm trying to answer them. And I really look forward to your feedback because it's really about, for me, these new possibilities and new questions that I'm asking. So with that, let me explain. This is the agenda for us today. Is I want to explain to you the sort of larger project out of which this comes. Particularly this project around the history of Enlightenment cosmology. And then within that frame, having understood what that means to me, to then talk about the complexities of the question of time within this cosmological thinking. So that will be the second part. So with that, what is Enlightenment cosmology to me? What is this project about? Many of you might know the work of Helge Krag, who's Danish historian, very celebrated, decorated historian, who more than anyone, I think, has established a historiography on the history of modern cosmology. And by that, he means the cosmological science, astrophysics, and cosmology as it's practiced today in now the 21st century university and in university-based science in this way. And you see here, he's given it this long durée kind of framing. And it's sort of against the grain of this that my work starts. And in his account, in Krag's account of what he calls it in a section, Enlightenment cosmology, he offers an account of these 2 works from the middle of the 18th century. The work on the left, Thomas Wright of Durham, is the starting point of a conversation in which he lays out his new thesis, new hypothesis of the universe founded upon the laws of nature. And here the key phrase, mathematical principles, which also comes with Kant's invocation of Newton and the Newtonian idea of mathematical principles of natural philosophy. Durham's work was not read by Immanuel Kant, but was referenced in a journal review. In a Hamburg journal. Kant at this point is finished with his philosophical studies and just beginning his career at the University of Königsberg and is embarking as he would in this period on work in natural philosophy, particularly mechanics, that's informed by the studies he did in Wolffian, Leibnizian natural philosophy. Wolff is seen as coining at some level the modern term cosmology in a work in Latin, Cosmologia, but Wolff's work is very much in the tradition of traditional scholastic natural philosophy, even if it's modernizing in certain ways. And so from that perspective, and then Kant, having studied that, free of even biblical authority or other sorts of traditional religious assumptions. Kant says, for example, that he believes in the Genesis story of a created matter, ex nihilo, that's at the starting point of creation. And he invokes biblical authority on certain occasions, even if on other occasions he very clearly reflects what we would describe as an Enlightenment mindset, when he in fact kind of asserts, for example, he asserts that he has no place in his natural philosophy for miracles. This is in fact to break with Newton, for example, on this, who allowed still for the possibility of the miraculous within his natural philosophy. So you get this combination of what to a retrospective eye is clearly a move towards what we recognize as secular, empirical, mathematical, scientific cosmology, always interspersed with, at other moments, these appeals to the Bible, these appeals to religious authority that seem to sort of be at odds with that as well. And there's this particular story in this account that illustrates perfectly this doubleness, the doubleness of Kant's stance on cosmology. And it's his account, he offers a hypothetical account, and he says very much, makes it very clear. And this, I mean, again, those of you who want to get into the history of this is a moment in which the whole question, Newton's famous statement of feigning no hypotheses, which is a foundational statement. He says, I don't know what gravity is, and I feign no hypotheses. All I've offered is a mathematical empirical account, and that's enough. A discourse of God's effects through natural philosophy is enough. We don't need to get at a metaphysical understanding of what's underneath it. That's what's behind the non fingo hypothesis statement. And it's the anchor for people like Voltaire and others to lay out an idea of a science, a natural science without metaphysics, that's going to become a cornerstone for Kant as well later. So you have this moment in the 1750s where this question of the value of and the nature of hypothetical reasoning is being debated openly, particularly in Paris and others. And Kant seems to get into that. Again, he's not yet critical Kant, so he's kind of playing the hypothesis game and sort of thinking about hypothesis. And he offers, while also suggesting that maybe it's just a hypothesis. In other words, it's speculative. A theory that suggests that maybe the Earth originally, in its original formation, had rings around it, like Saturn does. And he has a particular set of reasons for why that might be the case that he talks about. But then he makes this interesting comment here, where he suggests further, hypothetically, and sort of saying in a way, it's kind of whimsically, that this is even more hypothetical, that maybe the collapse of the rings into the Earth, because we don't have rings now, we don't see rings now, so where did they go? What happened to them? Maybe they collapsed into the Earth, and they were in fact then the cause of the universal flood that's talked about in Genesis. And it offers a possible physical explanation, a naturalist physical explanation for the great inundation that's recorded in Genesis, right? And then he goes further, and he notes that in Genesis, it said that after the flood, and in order to reconfirm his covenant with God, with the people, the living creatures, Noah and his descendants and the animals that have survived the flood, he creates a new sign of his covenant, the rainbow. And here you see at the top there, the statement in Genesis 9:16, whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. What Kant then goes on to say is, maybe this was in fact, why the rainbow of all covenants? Why choosing that symbol of all things? Maybe Kant says that God in his wisdom actually wanted to create a sign that reflected the former presence in the sky of the rings, so that those, at least to the first generation post flood, would look up and see the rainbow and remember the rings that would appear in the sky and their disappearance through the flood. And so here you see the line that I've been working on and I find really fascinating, which again, it's both a line offered in a kind of lighthearted way. I'm not claiming that this is a central argument for Kant at all. It's not. It's a sort of one little aside of, kind of speculative thinking. And yet at the same time, I find it as a historian, a really interesting and telling comment where he says, the similarity of the shape of this memorial sign with the event it signified could commend my hypothesis, his hypothesis about the former rings and their being the source of the flood and things like that, to those who are devoted to the dominant tendency of bringing the miracles of revelation into the same system as the ordinary laws of nature. And remember, he's already said elsewhere that he doesn't want to bring the miracles of revelation into his natural philosophy. And he's offering this just as a speculative naturalist account of this. But it's this line, there are those devoted to this dominant tendency of bringing the miracles of revelation of the same system as the ordinary laws of nature. And so my question, reading this in front of this, is who's he referring to? Who are these practitioners of the dominant tendency? And if they're dominant, that means one should find them in a kind of central place, not necessarily just marginal figures or something like that. Kant doesn't give any clues about who this might be, but a good guess, if you wanted to say who's he referring to, a good guess might be this work that was published in 1731 to 35. You see on the right, it was in its original German and Latin edition, a big folio-sized book. The title Kupferbibel is reflecting the fact that it's a book, as we'll see here, that combines biblical analysis, biblical scriptural exegesis with natural philosophy, natural science, and copper plate engravings. These lavish use of images done by the engraver Pfeffel, who's an important collaborator with Schweitzer. Schweitzer's at the end of his life, but he's already a fellow of the Royal Society of London. He's a member of the Leopoldina Academy and others. And so he's not by any stretch of the imagination here a marginal and obscure figure. He's a major figure. And what he's offering here, as it says, is a physica sacra, which is to say a holy physics or a sanctified natural science that attempts to join together natural science with scriptural exegesis and to unify the Bible with natural science. The book, too, is not just a provincial German phenomenon. Almost within a year after its appearance out of Augsburg and Ulm, it gets picked up by a major Amsterdam publisher who translates it into French. And I love this new subtitle, Histoire naturelle de la Bible, which situates it at the heart of what we would not problematically call Enlightenment, natural history and natural science with respect to the Bible and religion. It also is expanded to superfolio, even bigger, with an even more splendiferous presentation of its images, which we'll see here in a minute. But you see here, again, in French, La physique sacrée, Histoire naturelle de la Bible, which lays it out. Well, what are we looking at here? What is this? This, and this is where I'm getting into sort of some of my new arguments, this, I think, is an 18th century continuation of what had already been coined in the 17th century as a legitimate scientific paradigm or tradition, and that is to say, Philosophia Mosaica or Mosaic physics. This is the work of Robert Flood, who in these two works kind of coined the phrase. It comes out of earlier scholastic work in universities. People like Comenius early on are practitioners of this, and the term is sort of coined by them. But it's in bringing these works into print in London in particular that the phrase becomes more publicly known and identified in this way. And you see here in these two editions of Flood in this way. What immediately thinks of, particularly if you're in the United States, this doesn't have the same kind of resonance in the United States that, or it has in Europe and that it has in the United States, but obviously you think about creation science. And this is in fact a real destination you can visit. This is part of the Creation Museum. The Creation Museum is right across the Ohio River from Cincinnati in Kentucky. And then this is about 45 miles south. This is a reconstruction of Noah's Ark as found in the Bible. And you can go inside is fully equipped. It's like walking through a battleship / cruise ship. You see the picture of me and my son when we visited there. And creation science is a 19th century creation, 19th century program. And it's common to go back and look at Mosaic physics as creation science before the letter. But I actually think that that's really wrong. If you want to understand the history of creation science as it develops, you should read Ron Number's book, The Evolution of Scientific Creationism. And this is a book that talks about the emergence of creationism out of a 19th century battle between an established science and a newly clarified and distinct religion, where they're being talked about as enemies of one another. Mosaic physics, as described by Ann Blair, and this is the only systematic study of the Mosaic physics phenomenon that's ever been done. This is her article there. And she ends it in the 17th century. I think, in fact, the Schweitzer-Pfeffel work shows us that it's not dead by the 18th century. And if Kant is right, maybe it's a dominant tendency. Maybe it's a kind of mainstream part of 18th century science. If you judge books by the size and lavishness of their production, which is not a bad judge because it costs a lot of money to produce a book like that, and a book that's that lavishly produced conveys upon it an authority that it's only books of a certain import. And the modern, again, idea of coffee table books, of these being like lavish decorative books as opposed to professional science, just doesn't exist in the 18th century. There's only lavish books and non-lavish books. And there's no sense in which a scientific book is over here in its sort of detailed professional precision, and then over here is a lavish illustrated book. In fact, lavish illustrated books in many cases are the most authoritative scientifically. So there's a lot of reasons to think that this physique sacrée, Kupfer Bibel, is perhaps what Kant is referring to at the mainstream. And just to kind of finish this, I want to give you a sense of what this book is, and I'm going to use the images from the physique sacrée to show you. And the point really is that whereas creation science, as it emerges in the 19th century, is very much about a Christian backlash against the claim that science refutes religion, and is an attempt to defend the scientific truth of Christianity on scientific terms, newly clarified. What Mosaic physics is rather the old project sustained more systematically of Augustine's old claim that there never should be a contradiction between the book of nature and the holy writ, holy book. They're two revelations, they're two equally divine authorities, and there should never be a conflict. This is again at the center of the Galileo trial. And Mosaic physics, as it develops in the 18th century, I want to suggest, is simply good Christian natural philosophy, natural science, infused on the one hand with all the traditional approaches to cosmology that are inherent to the traditional of Christianity, but as you'll see, fully saturated as well with what we call modern science. So to kind of illustrate that very quickly, you see here, here's the two authors, and I think in the Physique Sacrée, it's important that they're each given status with a portrait and a kind of profile of each. On the left is Schweitzer, who began his career as a naturalist and a botanist, but on the right is Pfeffel, the engraver, whose art is being put forward as equally authoritative. The book opens with this lavishing, and again, the size of this needs to be constantly remembered. We're talking about, a book that it's like this big. This is a very major book. So these are a fold out within that. And you see here, and again, everything from clearly armillary spheres and those sorts of things, but also geometric diagrams that both show geocentric but also heliocentric understandings of the cosmos, the zodiac, and then up at the top in the corner, the triangle with the tetragrammaton. And so this fusion, right, of natural science as we understand it today, modern natural science, with the lingering importance and influence of Christian understandings as well. It then opens into a series of planches, is the way the book works. It's ultimately 750 of these, and they're text image assemblages where you have the passage from Genesis, you then have textual commentary with footnotes that are referring to all sorts of sources, including church fathers and religious authorities, but also to modern natural philosophy, modern scientists as well, integrating them too. And then these naturalized images by Pfeffel that further articulate the cosmology that's being offered. And here the key is to realize when one looks at this, that these are not mere illustrations of what's in the text. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the text references what's in the image. You'll see letters, for example, on the image that correspond, not in this one, but the one we'll see, to what's in the text. But very often the image offers content, offers interpretive understandings that have no relation at all to what's found in the text. And it's being presented as working together in terms of a harmony of image and text in this way. And so just quickly here, just to look through some others. And you see down below, each image is captioned with a particular Genesis text in this case, although it goes on into other parts of the Bible, and what's being used there as well. And then one last one where you see, once we get into creation of specific specimens and things like that, Schweitzer's training as a naturalist, as a botanist comes into form. So this is my project. My project begins by wanting to take seriously Kant's statement that this kind of science, cosmological science, is in fact as important in the Enlightenment as that science which we think of as proto-contemporary, proto-modern in this way. And the phrase for me then, Enlightenment cosmology, is very much a period label. And it's not 18th century, it's kind of, what, and I'm resisting, I want to use pre-modern without a hyphen, because I'm trying to resist the way early modern and others already stack the deck in favor of the idea of a brewing modernity or a progress towards modernity. Enlightenment was an actor's category. Enlightenment is a nice way to understand the new scientific developments that happen in Europe after 1500. And I do not think that this is merely old. What I'm trying to figure out with Enlightenment cosmology is the way in which, in a kind of crooked, contingent, messy way, changes begin here that are not at all, they still seem alien to our cosmology today, but they are preparing the way in different crooked ways to the cosmology we have now. So I'm situating Enlightenment cosmology then between the idea of an age of religion and myth versus our current age of scientific modernity, but also speaking more scientifically between a world where science is still natural philosophy. Science and natural philosophy, properly understood in this period, is at once what we call natural science, theology, and philosophy. All three are one. We now separate those into three distinct domains. And so it's still an age of natural philosophy into the 19th century, but also then distinct from what we have now, which is professionalized, university-based astrophysics, cosmology, the modern sciences. In situating Enlightenment cosmology between those, between our cosmology now and the cosmology of ancient times, I am explicitly trying to resist progressive uniformitarian narratives of scientific development. That's going back to Krog. That's where my jumping off point. He wants to tell a kind of progressive story. So you get certain steps in Kant and Durham, but other steps they're not. And then someone else comes farther this way and less this way. And over sort of little baby steps, you progressively develop into the world we're in today. I don't like those kinds of accounts of science, and I want to resist them in this kind of presentation. And then similarly as well, anything Kuhnian here would be a misreading. I don't want to talk about a kind of ancient paradigm, an Enlightenment paradigm, and then a modern paradigm, and the idea of scientific revolutions. I do want to retain a kind of a sort of developmental account, but one, as it says there, that is understood as a crooked, contingent, ironic at certain points set of developments, and a very human set of developments. Touchstones for me, historiographically, are the works of Edward Grant, who is a wonderful historian, but in his phrase of the medieval and the ancients, the work on the left is his history of natural philosophy, which you see goes back to the ancients as it should, but then you see ends for him in the 19th century. I agree with that, as we'll see. This medieval cosmos history that ends emphatically in 1687, I very much disagree with. I do not think that one talks about Newton, that's the date of the publication date of Principia, as somehow the birth of the modern in this way. In many ways, Newton, as recent scholarship is showing, is anything but a modern, even if certain aspects of what he did is foundational for modern science today. And then the book on the right, I'm not sure if you know about this book. This is a kind of classic. It's a fabulous book that kind of is under the radar. I know not enough people know about this book. It's a work very much in the philosophical history of science, or history of philosophy as much as history of science. And it wants to posit, it works by positing, which I'm taking almost literally, I'm giving a new name to it, but a middle period between the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern proper, which is a 19th century phenomenon for Funkenstein, that he sees in terms of a fusion. He talks about it as an age of secular theology. And both words are important, that people like Newton, people like Leibniz, people like Descartes are clearly involved in a new kind of secular science, and we look back on them as breaking science free of certain kinds of religious frameworks. But at the same time, and for them, they cannot but not think of what they're doing as theology as well. And what he sees at that moment is a moment in which for those centuries between, 1550 and 1850, you basically have a kind of intersection where what looks like science to us was also to them theology, and they wouldn't have seen a way to disentangle them. And then similarly, what looks like theology, Christian exegesis, biblical scholarship, these sorts of things, was pursued with every attention of it being a leading science. And so secular theology as a kind of two sides of one whole. And that's what I'm doing as well. And just to sort of end this and then get into some of the details, what I use then to frame what I'm doing is the idea that the real moment of change is in the 19th century. And that the cosmology that we have today, if we want to understand that, we need to look at it in terms of these 19th century transformations, which is also, I could have added here, I didn't, the transformation that brings about creationism, creation science versus natural science, religion versus science in this way. But secularization itself is, again, not, I think, a kind of gradualist and thing, and I don't think secularization is fully there in the 18th century even if the signs of it are afoot. I think things like the French Revolution are key. And, by the end of the 18th century with Laplace and others, we're beginning into the 19th century to start seeing a fully secular science emerging, but it's in that period. And to talk about earlier period in terms of secularization, I think is to misrepresent it. Similarly and separately, disenchantment. I don't think secularization and disenchantment are synonyms, but there clearly is in the 19th century. And here I think industrial society is key. All kinds of transformations that go on. All of these kind of loop back and reinforce one another. But the idea of a world without mystery, a world without the supernatural, the idea of the human being as not only a la Protagoras, the measure of all things, but the master of all things, I think is key. And again, these are things that really come about. And I think industrialization is really as important as anything to this. And so we need to think about a post-industrial cosmology as opposed to pre-industrial as well. Along those lines, the rise of industrial instrumental time. I was thinking about, for those who study the history of modern physics and modern cosmology, the famous argument, and the kind of, to me, still really distinctive argument of Einstein's 1905 paper, the famous electromagnetic electron bodies, the 1905 paper, the special relativity paper, where he so sort of assertively, but kind of amazingly, makes time that which is found on clocks. And that's going to be, and that's sort of in a way the key. And Peter Gallison has recently in his account stressed the way this comes out of Einstein's own instrumental work, trying to get train schedules to reconcile. But the way he operates with this very instrumental, very mechanical kind of understanding of what time is, he's reflecting what happens. And there's a long history of this. Mechanical clocks and other things go back a long way. But I think there's a really important 19th century intensification of this. And I put some of these things, Harrison's marine chronometer, 1770, which solves the longitude problem, the ability to take a clock overseas and keep track of time and longitude, therefore, as one navigates. That's 1770. It's a very late development. The standardization of time, I couldn't help but think we had a little bit of a screw up. Wasn't a problem, but a little bit of screw up with this talk, in that Minnesota, where I am right now, went on to daylight savings time on Saturday, but you haven't yet done so. So I was trying to log into this meeting an hour early. That's what I'm talking about, that kind of global standardized time where people just take for granted a uniform time frame that's measured by clocks and our watches and instrumental. That's another 19th century development. And then just globalization itself. I couldn't find the reference to this, but there's a very good article that was been published recently, periodizing globalization. And obviously 1492 and the creation of a truly global connected world through European maritime exploration, navigation, the rise of empire and colonization and things like that. Certainly that's a beginning of globalization. But this article says that a really important moment is in the middle of the 19th century, where people, because of global communication structures, because the way life has been operating is such that it's so constantly connected in a standard way to global understandings and global awareness, that creates our modern sense of globalization, in which we really do feel locally to be embedded in systems that are truly global in that way. The philosopher Paul Virilio has called this too, to add another dimension of it, the dromosphere, in that this kind of global instrumental time structure that we live in is also a life at the pace of the machines, and particularly electronic life at the speed of light, right? Where we're now shaped in our local living by the instrumentality of machines and time in this way. And that, again, this separates the 19th century and after from the period of Enlightenment cosmology. The creation of modern science itself, by which I mean institutionally the professional vocational status of a scientist. every historian of science now knows that this term scientist is coined in 1834 by Whewell to note, he says, a new type that exists, the scientist, the professional focused scientist, not the natural philosopher and not all the other things that would go into, say, Kant's job description or Durham's or others in this way. Within cosmology itself, you have the change from traditional old-fashioned optical astronomy, which had been practiced, again, is enhanced by lenses with Galileo and Kepler, but is still optical into the 19th century, and instead radio astronomy, which is a completely different mode of relating to and connecting to the heavens in this way. And then finally, the shift from the historical sciences being, in a sense, an unmarked out assemblage around this idea of universal history, which I'll talk about here in a minute, to all the specialized scientific historical sciences, from history itself to geology, human geography, anthropology. And it's in that context then that historians talk about the birth of big time. Archbishop Usher in the late 17th century could say that the time frame of the Earth was 6,006 years. We'll come back to this claim in a minute. I grew up in the 70s and 80s where we watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos, in which he made famous the idea of billions and billions of years and billions of billions, all these billions and billions of stars. This idea of vastness, bigness, and the kind of cosmos that now is beyond human proportions and human limitations. And this is also a part of this. So with that, when I spend the rest of my time here, just, and here I'm going to really inventory more than anything else. What it means then, if you think about Enlightenment cosmology, the way I think about it, what it means then to think time, cosmological time. And here I really want Enlightenment cosmology to be a science. It's not pre-science, it's pre-modern science. And so I hope, and this is what we'll see, that by thinking about what the question of time presented to Enlightenment cosmologists, to those working in this time, there will be resonances with what people who are thinking about cosmology today are thinking about in this way. And here I might argue, I mean, why Enlightenment cosmology? Why this complex historical frame? I think it's actually more useful to think the past in terms of its difference with us than in terms of its progenitor role. In other words, what a historian like Krog represents is the idea is to understand past science in relation to our science. Now we go look for our beginnings, right? Our early primitive steps. I don't find that very useful. I think it's really much more useful to think about the past as something other than ours, and maybe from that otherness to get insights in how we might think quantum gravity or Big Bang in new ways, by recognizing the way in which in Enlightenment cosmology time was conceptualized. So that's what I'm going to try to suggest here by doing this inventory. By structural complexities, I mean that we're still in a Christian frame. That, you know, so it's really the breaking free in the 19th century of the taken for grantedness of the Christian frame, the kind of that rupture. That's where the French Revolution, I think, can't be understated as an important moment, when it, you know, reframes time itself, and it takes Notre Dame Cathedral and makes it the temple of reason with an altar to philosophy. And you know, these again are radical steps that are then conservative reaction ensues. But I think these are the important ruptures that matter, and it's after those that life really becomes different, not before. So just some things to think about with this. The thing to think about with the Christian frame is the sense, right, of the cosmos as the result of an eternal God, a God who the very essence of God in this understanding is eternal, everything, and completely unchanging, right? Perfection, a perfect God. So it's sort of the eternity of God is key. And here we'll get into the whole issue of the creation and the created world in this sort of way. But in this framing, you see here the God in his throne with the celestial empyrean around him. Remember that is always as it has been and always as it will be. There is no change in that world. So there's no time in that sense, in that frame. And the cosmos, as the emanation or the result of this deity, at some level is a cosmos without time. Now, what one has is the creation of man, of the world, and particularly the choice of Adam, which leads to the fall. And it's here that time enters in because change enters in. With the fall of man from his position in Eden, where he's at one with the perfect God, you then have time, and the world, the earth, the world of man, the world of fallen creation is a world of change and a world of transformation. And so time enters in here, but time as well within the eternity of the cosmos overall. Just one other representation that I just love of this is this world map here, which, see if I can, you see that mouse there. Here is the center of the earth, center of the world, and this is the earth. This is the world without the Empyrean, without the celestial Empyrean, right? Just planet Earth. And you see here, the center of it is Jerusalem, the navel. Note up here at the top to the east, because that's scripturally where Christ is said to return from, the head of Christ, the Garden of Eden. And then if you go here, note the hand, and then down below, and I'll highlight that here. An embodied world, embodied in Christ, but as I'll get into here in a minute, an incarnate deity Christ. In Christian understandings, the eternity of God was made flesh, was put into the world of change, was put into the world of time, and offered a story of his suffering, his teachings, his suffering, his passion on the cross, but then his resurrection, and the resurrection as a promise of the possibility of rejoining God in the eternal time-free life, right, of Christianity. So the whole question of the incarnation here, God is incarnate, as we'll see, is a fundamental aspect of Christianity. One last image to sort of illustrate this is the Church of Hagia Sophia in what's now Istanbul, what was Constantinople when it was built. The footprint for it was set by Constantine. It was one of his original in creating his new city, his new Christian city of Constantinople in the 4th century. But it was built in its splendor by the Emperor Justinian, the same emperor who actually shut down the Academy of Athens and others. And so a Christianizing emperor, hostile to pagan philosophy, who built this church, particularly with the domes. It's now been converted into a mosque, and so the minarets are the Islamic edition once the Turks took over Constantinople. And you'll see on the interior the new Arabic Islamic decorations. But what's interesting about this is that they fit actually more seamlessly with the original conception of this church, because in many ways, the Eastern Christian understanding of the cosmos that's represented here is one that's more harmonizing with the Arabic understanding, also an Abrahamic religion like Judaism, of the cosmos. But the idea here, this was a domed church, not the traditional basilicas that are more standard in the Christian church, which are always oriented east-west with the altar at the east. Instead, the dome is more centralized and is to represent, in a sense, one's place in the cosmos. One would often have had in this dome, and earlier on, it probably had this underneath these Arabic descriptions, Arabic words from the Quran, Arabic scriptural passages, and just sacred Arabic being represented there. It would have had an image of God the Father, God the Lord of the cosmos, and was a presentation, you as a human being underneath it were in the cosmos as an eternal whole, right? And you, so at the top, at the very end, you enter into God, the eternal God. No intervention of the incarnation. And this is what I mean, where this is where Arabic cosmology, which is not claiming, the Muslim tradition does not claim an incarnate God. Jesus is a prophet, Jesus is an important figure, but is a figure that is not a deified human being. That's the height of blasphemy, to say God incarnate, God material. So in this Eastern presentation, which was also downplaying the incarnation and celebrating more the eternal God, you see a fusion of one strand of Orthodox Christianity, the Eastern understanding, with then the Arabic understanding in this way. And so you see that here. So it's just to say that this notion of an eternal cosmos is very much at the center of Christianity, and particularly all Orthodox Christianities, but also other kinds of Abrahamic religions that trace the connection to the same, the God of the Hebrew Bible, the God that called Abraham. So within this, time emerges then through creation and through the challenges of understanding how creation, and here the opening of Genesis is key, how God the Father, the eternal God, brought into the world change, time, and this and that. And in fact, one answer is through the fall and this kind of distinction between, as we'll see here with Augustine, the city of God and the city of man. But there's other ways of understanding it. So it's the question of creation that is particularly the source of these questions about time. And they're the creation here where you have this, what is time and what is creation within an eternal God, an eternal perfect God. Augustine of Hippo is the singular figure most responsible for this particular set of issues, along with countless others within the Latin Western Church, which again, I want to always emphasize is not the same thing as the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Ethiopian Church or the Armenian Christian Church. Christianity in this has to be understood in terms of competing Christianities. And while we have Western Latin Orthodoxy, never at any moment do we not have contests with different Christianities. One of the openings for me of what I want to call Enlightenment cosmology is the Reformation, which makes explicit a rebellion and a battle over the true nature of Christianity, which is saturated at every step with new sciences like philology and historical criticism and these sorts of things. So the Reformation is a particular moment of rebellion and real turmoil within the Christian church. But in fact, there's a 3,000-year history of, or 2,000-year history of basically Christian battles with each other over what the true church is. Augustine is key because of bringing in a particular understanding of time and creation within the idea of an eternal God. And he does this through his distinction between the city of God and the city of man. And fundamentally there, what that is two worlds, two divine worlds. The city of God is an eternal world. It's the word of God. But there is also, because of the fall, the city of man. And it sets up then this distinction between what in Christian terminology is sacred time and profane time. Sacred time is time in the sense that you have the idea of a flow of time in the sense, for example, in sacred time, one can talk of the creation of the world in Genesis, a creation governed by God's reason, by God's providence, and then in the Christian formulation, the incarnation, the moment that still dates the before and after, right, of our modern time frames, right? The time of Jesus, the time of the Christ, who has his time on earth, life, death, resurrection, ascension, that then points to another time, the end time, when the creation will come to an end and all who are to be saved will be joined together with God again in the eternal heaven, and those who are not will go away into hell and into away from the divine eternity. So there is this sense of time, a flow, beginning, middle, end in sacred time, but it's of a very different sort, and it's basically very heterogeneous. For example, the 20 or 30 years that Jesus walked on earth are an incredibly important moment in time, whereas from the point of view of the city of man and profane time, whole millennia passed that are kind of not important. Profane time is what we think of as our modern secular time. It is the time of clocks, the time of humans living, rising, dying, new people coming to be, the flow of what we now think of as clock time. That only has meaning in a Christian frame in terms of its passage to the sacred time. And there's a fundamental distinction then between sacred history and profane history, between life in sacred time and the profane time. The theological message of Augustine is, you humans don't get caught up in profane time and thinking profane time matters. Instead, live your life according to the promise of returning to sacred time in heaven and the afterlife in these ways. Charles Taylor, in his book, A Secular Age, has a great description of this heterogeneity, in which he says, for someone who is a devout Christian, a very pious Christian, when they wake up on Easter morning, and it's the idea of the passion and the resurrection of Christ, and then its symbolic representation, the Eucharist, where one experiences the eternity in profane time, right? He says, when someone wakes up on Easter morning, the fact that by the date on their clocks and their calendars, it might have been 2,100 years ago or 22,000 years ago that Jesus was resurrected, that makes no sense. It has no meaning, because on that morning and that moment, you are part of the eternity of God in the resurrection. And so that there is flowing through sacred time, or flowing through profane time is the point, this heterogeneous sacred time. And this is something I want to think a lot more about, because I think this is what characterizes that Enlightenment moment, what it means. And rather than it going away in modern time, I think it's been secularized in many ways. The idea of the singular moment of profane time as being meaningful or significant is a relic of this presence of sacred time. And so when we think of decisive moments in profane time, we are at some level bringing back in this idea that there's a special time also present amidst what is otherwise utterly uniform, utterly homogeneous, utterly meaningless from this point of view, secular time in this way. So,
JB,
yeah.
can I ask you to
to wrap up.
Yep, thank you.
Yep, yeah. Okay, let me, I just want to say a couple of things here about changes within Enlightenment cosmology, particularly the emergence of this new pre-modern science. I like this as a perfect example of Enlightenment science, because it doesn't exist really until fairly late in the Renaissance. There's not a sort of systematic pursuit of chronology. What you see there is the attempt to unify into one history, sacred scripture, but also profane history and profane documents and sources, but also nature, that is eclipses, comet appearances, things like this. It's out of this that you get the famous declaration from Usher about when the world is created, to the date and the month and these sorts of things in this way. But by the 19th century, this doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. And yet Isaac Newton is a key practitioner of it and agrees with Usher on his dating of the beginning. And so to think about the Principiant here, one could say a lot about Newton's absolute time, his notion of the Pantocrator God, the way he integrates notions of a God's will and reason into it. This has been a cornerstone of new scholarship. Increasingly, Newton is being seen as the fully theological thinker that he was, and not as an aside. So rather than the religious worlds of Isaac Newton, one needs to recognize that he was a practitioner of a theological science, or a secular theology in Funkenstein's mode in that way. And then the emergence out of that of naturalism. So I will stop here now. I was going to sort of say some more details. I can give you particular examples here, but maybe I'll do that with specific examples. The specific problems are how to preserve eternity. Eternity is essential. and yet how to do that with respect to the story of creation. I'll just show you here, and I can come back to these. Here is the opening line of Genesis as translated directly from the Hebrew Bible into an English translation. And here the key is, when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and the wind from God sweeping over the water, end of aside, God said, let there be light. This is a formulation that does not imagines already a pre-existing world when God began to create heaven and earth, but there's already a world here. It fights against the idea of a creation ex nihilo. In fact, I could say lots about that if you want. The creation ex nihilo is the orthodox doctrine, particularly from Augustine, particularly from his Confessions, which has a whole book on the question of time in creation, but is continually and persistently questioned within Christianity. And there are all sorts of other understandings of the creation that are not in the beginning to go here. So you look at here, the Latin Vulgate, which says in principio, which can be, as it is in the Gospel of John, in the beginning, can be beginning, but it can also be in the structure of things, in the architecture, in the nature of the world, an eternal understanding. So in the eternal understanding was the Logos, or in the beginning was the Logos. So you see how there's this issue constantly of trying to sustain an eternal understanding of the cosmos, while at the same time figuring out how to understand creation. And then the more classic formulations, King James in English, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form. And you see how it's more complicated. What he's he's created the heaven and the earth, but there's already waters and darkness and all this in this formulation. And then just showing that the French is the same. So preserving eternity, making sense then of an incarnation, God as human, God as flesh, God as material, which infuses then into ordinary human time, sacred time in crucial ways. And then this question of a providential God, God that's acting with reason, but God that also has a will, the God that makes choices. And here the question of grace, God bringing grace into the world. This is key for Newton. Newton resists a uniform mechanical understanding of the cosmos, because to do so is to not allow for God to step in and perform a miracle or to enact grace, because he can't possibly do that if he's going to keep the laws of nature regular in this sense. So the need for a divine reason that also has the free will to interrupt the laws of nature, this is key to Newton and many others, at the same time that there are others who are moving towards a more uniform, a God that's a deist God, a mechanical God, a God that's without a will, or the will is only at the very first moment that sets the mechanism in motion. So like I said, I can come back to any of these and talk more about each of these, but I'll stop right there. And thank you for your patience.
So thank you very much. Are there questions? Yes, Alvaro.
Let me.
That was a clapping.
Okay.
It was a clapping. Okay. So then Danielle.
That was also clapping. Although I wish I guess I'm interested in this last thing you said about creation ex nihilo. So I guess in my own work, I've been trying to kind of push against the idea that that the creation ex nihilo it's kind of the only type of Christian story. Yeah. But I wish I can get some references from you.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I can use the chat here, right? So I just found something that I'll put in the chat. Yeah, I gotta find it here. And I'll say, like I said, I literally just found it, and therefore it worries me that it's published by, it's connected somehow to the Mormon Church. And I scanned through it, and it looks to be a pretty, at least empirical survey of and I found all the people that I knew about in it, and sort of seemingly reasonable representations of how they thought about this question. So that's what leads me to share it with you. But if you find that you start to get suspicious about maybe an agenda in it that seems questionable, let me know. I'd be curious in this one. But so in a nutshell, creation ex nihilo is maybe the simplest way to continue to assert an eternal God. If you need to have a creator deity behind all creation that is outside of time, that is outside of matter, right? That is outside of everything. And yet in that very same way is therefore the progenitor of everything. Then to say that everything that is not God is simply created by God, right, is the simplest way to do it. But from the minute it's uttered as a proposition, it raises the question of, but wait a minute. And you go all the way back to Aristotle and the idea that this is an impossibility, right? You cannot create something from nothing, right? It just gets, that's philosophically irrational in this way. It leads then to a whole set of attempts to get around it, to sort of figure out how there is a creation that somehow at once not God. I mean, I guess the other extreme, this is Spinoza in a nutshell, but Spinoza, who I found sources where Spinoza is being worried about, not because of this radical new modern God nature philosophy, but because he seems to represent a return of older Gnostic understandings of the creation and of the world, or not the creation, but the world, that were declared heretical and heterodox at the very beginning of early Christian doctrinal development. And what's the problem there is God becoming material, God becoming, human at any level, or material in these ways, and God therefore being subject to time, God having the possibility to think in time, to make choices, to make decisions. And the whole notion, right, of providence and predestination is about just the unfolding. Plotinus is really key here in offering, through his idea of emanation, an idea of a world that is not God. It's the world of, what we would call creation, but emanation not as a moment of creation, a moment of actual working in time to produce what isn't there before, that the world just emanates. And in that way, God's emanations, being what we might call creation, have a quality of eternity to them. So this book here, recent find, I'm not sure what to say, is at least a place to start. And what you'll get there in this survey is a list of you'll find the scriptural passages where it's grounded, and then the early Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Philo of Alexandria. There's a whole, and then again, the thing about this too is that the early Christianity is based on the idea of an Old Testament revelation that prophesizes the coming of a Messiah, right? What this means is that's why the Old Testament, 2/3 of any Christian Bible is the Old Testament. It's because the Judaic understanding of this is as crucial as the Christian New Testament understanding, right? They're, again, supposed to harmonize. If you go into ancient Judaism or Jewish mysticism, you there too find this tension between an all perfect, all timeless and uncreated and unmade God and the story in Genesis, including in like, I'm reading right now a 17th century work by Franciscus von Helmont. It's called Sketch of a Christian Kabbalah, and it's attempting to create a synthesis between Christian understandings of the cosmos and Jewish Kabbalistic understandings. They have in the Kabbalah and von Helmont, who, and this work, by the way, is according to the person who introduced it in the translation of it. It's a simultaneous Latin original English translation that I'm reading. Spector, who's her last name, who did this work. She talks in the introduction that this was an important work for Leibniz, an important work for Henry Moore and Anne Conway, and sort of that 17th century Neoplatonism that is very important for Newton. What that work lays out is the idea of what we might describe as the pre-Genesis 1 creation of the world, in which you almost get an account in which Genesis 1 kind of begins in medias res, sort of, and there's already the eternal God who's created this principle of, it's called Adam Kadmon, but it's just, the point is this principle of creation that then is the actual creator. So it allows, once one has this first step that's outside of Genesis and outside of the scriptural authority, for Genesis to tell the story of a creation. But the key is, who is doing the creation? Who is the God of the first sentence? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It's already a created thing or an emanation from the true eternal God. And there's all kinds of Jewish scripture. There's a Jewish scriptural text called the Book of Jubilees that tells a completely different story of Genesis. It's got this interesting formula. It was one of the things found in the Dead Sea Scrolls documents, but it also was known. Justin Martyr writes about it, others. So it's part of the touchstone of early Christianity.
Sorry, JP, but we have also other people that wants to ask.
Yeah. So let me just finish this sentence and then we'll go on. What you have in there is this actual accounting in scripture of the pre-creation that then comes, and this is in the Ethiopian church, this is a sacred text. It's pseudo-epigrapha in other centuries. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have several questions and remarks.
Okay.
But I first would like to know how many people want to ask questions. So Laura was before Federico, and after, apart from them, are there other questions?
And I promise to be less extensive in my answers.
So Laura.
Please, can you hear me? Because I have a bit.
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. So I was, I thank you for the nice, very interesting talk. And yes, I was thinking about the passages from pre-modern, early modern to modern cosmology, or more in general, this relationship between pre-modern times and modern knowledge, let's say. Yeah. And in particular, I was thinking about the relationship between images and words.
Yeah.
And we see from the books, exactly from the books you showed, but in general, so the Baroque, the books of the Baroque literature are full of images. There is an interaction between text and images in the pre-modern times, and what happens to images in the modern literature, in the modern cosmology. So my questions, or maybe I want to know your ideas or your opinion about it. So the question is, if you think they disappear completely, or if they remain somehow, they survive in a kind of immaterial images, analogies, metaphors. This is my curiosity or my question.
All right, I promise to be less extensive, but you've asked a question that's actually at the very heart of my work. And if I was going to do this talk instead more about my project, I would develop the arguments I make about why I think it matters that Pfeffel is raised to the status of an equal knower as Schweitzer in the Physique Sacrée. And I think in general, if one looks at particularly late 17th into 18th century, if one judges late 17th into 18th century science, as I suggested, by, we'll say the important books are the ones that are expensive, large edition, lavishly illustrated books. Those cost the most, and I'm using the phrase in this in writing about this as Enlightenment big science, okay? Because if you're going to play this game, if you're going to be one of the people that's seen in that world, and reviewers, when they write about it, they often stress the materiality of the book for several paragraphs before getting into the context, and this is important. So I think that, in fact, images are crucial to Enlightenment cosmology in a way that they stop being in the 19th century. Now, why is that, or what happens? I would encourage you, I'm very influenced by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison's book, Objectivity, which talks about the mid-19th century in terms of an emphatic, mechanical, and imagination-free objectivity, where what becomes anathema to good science, very different from the 18th century, is anything speaking of the imagination or of judgment or of these sorts of things. Instead, the highest epistemic virtue is a mechanical, human-free sort of thing in this way. You could go with other things. I think professionalization means that there is a split. In the same way that there's a new split between science and religion, there's a new split, I think, between art and science, right? And art is constructed as the fine arts, as the world of aesthetics, of these sorts of things. Kant's already doing that, right? And instead, science is somehow not pictorial in a new way. Peter Gallison's also his book, Image and Logic, about particle physics, talks about, in that context, in 20th century particle physics, those who want pictorial evidence, and he has in mind, scatter diagrams of electrons and things like this, versus those who want quantitative data. That's the logic, kind of wants streams of data. He reads it in terms of a kind of tension in particle physics. But nevertheless, the image is in a very different place in that story than it is in the 18th century. So clear as a change. And I'll just say one other thing that you might be able to help me. I know I've heard people talk about, so when I look at those Pfeffel images in Physique Sacrée, the first thing I think of course, is Hubble telescope images, right? I know I've heard modern cosmologists, modern astrophysicists say that those are just decoration. They're not really meaningful from a scientific point of view, because from the point of view of radio astronomy, what you need is, spectral data and all this sort of stuff. That's how astronomy is done and cosmology is done. Those pictures, yeah, they're pretty, they're spectacular, they capture the imagination, but they're not really relevant to astrophysics or science. Now, that might be an overstatement. I don't know if that's right, but it would be an answer to your question, that we're now at a mode where the kind of pictures that Pfeffel did in the 18th century go from being integral parts of the science itself to being merely ways to get the popular imagination going so that they pay the taxes to fund the radio telescopes and all that sort of stuff that way.
Okay, Federico.
Hi, I also want to thank you very much for the interesting talk. And I wanted to ask you something about, you mentioned the distinction between two different conception of time that there were in a certain Christian tradition, the sacred and profane time. I wanted to ask you, what are the reasons to make this distinction, to think that there was this distinction between the two different conceptions of time? So why not to think that, for example, there was a conception of time, and as time that goes on, somehow in a linear fashion, and these very important religious events, creation, apocalypse, are just events that happen in a faraway past and a faraway future.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the short answer is because it demeans God to lower God to human conceptualizations, that the God that one places at the origin of all things, that one worships, that is in charge of our fate as creatures and is something completely other than us. Augustine develops the two worlds, city of God, city of man, in order to help humans build a bridge, and in particular to get them to see how when they pursue life fully oriented towards profane time, they are in effect living at odds with God, right? Because again, you put it together with Augustine's idea that as fallen sinners, we are trapped in these drives towards our lusts, towards our passions. And what we need is the distant God. And again, that's also in all the different Christianities that I'm trying to get a grip on. One of the key ways I order them are those like Augustinian Christianity that posit a really chasm between fallen humans and God. And this is the fundamental problem for an Augustinian Christian. How do you find God? How do you get back to God when you are so distant from God? This will be re-articulated through Calvin, actually, within Protestantism in this way. Other Christianities, on the other hand, collapse that. And there's a whole series of Christianities, including Arianism, Unitarianism, that say that's the precise reason for the incarnation, to bring this God into the world and show God as fully human, to build this bridge so that you, by, and this is what leads to, you see this a lot in the United States because of our evangelical character, what would Christ do? What would Jesus do, right? You live Jesus's way because he's a model of how to live as the perfect human in that way. That's to collapse that distance. But back to Augustine, why the distinction? It's because it would demean God to do it otherwise. And yet, one of the things that I think happens in the period of Enlightenment cosmology is that chasm is collapsed. I mean, and in a way, Spinoza is a perfect illustration of this in the God-nature, union. But in all sorts of ways, one elevates nature, physis, to a kind of divinity, or collapses the distant God into a deified nature and creates a kind of oneness. And that's what allows then profane time, secular time, to become time full stop. As I said, time full stop, time to code, time alone, time by itself. No more need to distinguish between them. And yet already we think about, as I mentioned, you think about moments in your ordinary flow of time that have sort of higher significance or higher meaning. So it's not gone, even if what now is the uniform standard is a kind of homogeneous, regular, tick-tock kind of clock time flowing. In English, secular has two meanings that I think is perfect. I wonder if they were etymologically originated this way. But the most common use of the word secular, when you say secular time, is just non-religious, right? Non-Christian. But secular also simply means uniform, regular. And that's what happens, is sort of secular time ceases being different from religious time, and what uniform, regular, secular time becomes time itself in this way. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I generally avoid exploring my position as a chair and try not to ask questions, not to steal time to others. But first of all, I would like to thank you very much for this broad picture that you offer to us, and I have several questions and remarks. Let's start with the easier part, at least for me, in the sense that at least on universal natural history and theory of evidence, I have something to say. And first thing is that the passage you quoted, I always read it in a different way, namely it's a critique of Swedenborg. It's a critique of cosmological models built precisely on spiritualism or the Bible, which are two different things, by the way, of course. And what Kant is trying to do in 1755, at least to me, is to offer for the first time, as far as we know in the history of cosmology, the application of Newton's law beyond the solar system, because before Kant's work, nobody tried to apply Newton's physics, Newton's laws of mechanics beyond the solar system. So this is the first thing. Therefore, it's true that God is mentioned in Kant's text in 1755. But it's also true that the work opens saying, give me matter and I will build up a world out of it. So for Kant, the assumption of matter is necessary rather than the assumption of God. Is necessary in order to build up a cosmological model. The reference to the spheres is taken from Huygens, which is who is one of the few authors that Kant really read. So we know that we have, the catalog of the books that he. I mean, of course, he read more than the books that he had in his library, but we are sure that it's Huygens that he has in mind rather than Tycho himself when describing the structure of the solar system. And in general, in all his works in natural science from 1754 to 1756, we have evidence that he rejects the mixture, so to speak, of biblical exegesis and natural science. So for him, natural science cannot be or cannot rely on the sacred Bible. One must clearly separate the two things. So I say this, and I go to the second part of my remark, because very interesting, Kant published an excerpt of this 1755 work in 1791, so after the French Revolution. And there is no mention of God, there is no mention of creation. Schöpfung. The word is not used anymore in the writing in the same way as it was widely used in 1755. But this cannot be really due to the French Revolution, because we know that Kant was highly critical with respect to the French Revolution. We know that he considers a barbaric act to cut the head of a king or a queen. Said that violence took place after 1789 in Paris and in France. And this has nothing to do with the real revolution that was to alienate the power to the Constitutional Assembly much before 1789, so it was in 1786. So the point that I want to suggest here is that there was a resistance to the French Revolution. So today we call it French Revolution and we attribute to it certain meaning. But at that time in Prussia, the French Revolution was seen as I said, as a pure act of violence of the people, of course, with some reason, but it was seen as a danger, as an extreme danger, and it was actually in the consequences with the invasion of France. I mean, Napoleon invaded several territories in the actual in Germany. I mean, it was precisely this. It was death, destruction, and so on. And also the end of several astronomical projects, such as those of the Palatinate. So this is just to mention that, in my view, it's not true that the French Revolution helped in reshaping cosmology in the 18th century. On the other side, what I think is that the work done by, for sure, by the people in the academy, both in Paris and in Berlin, I'm thinking of D'Alembert, Euler, and others, certainly helped to reshape the relationship between theology and cosmology. And frankly speaking, if we endorse the distinction between observational cosmology and theoretical cosmology, or if you like, between the between theoretical cosmology, like building cosmological models, it's the activity of building cosmological models. Well, nowadays, there is a tendency in philosophy of cosmology and in those that, for example, are in the network, in networks supported by the Templeton Foundations, or you know, I'm thinking about the people in Oxford, for example, but also mathematicians like Carr. I mean, they think that at some point, if physics, if the laws of physics and our theories cannot account for a solid cosmological model, then we move toward theology. And this is more or less a move that was similar to that present in some of the authors that you mentioned in the pre-modern era, let's say. However, I believe that we have, precisely for what you said, the tools in order to say that cosmology is not related to theology, but it's related to technological progress, to anthropology, for example, to economics. And precisely the thing that you mentioned, namely the birth of radio astronomy, shows that in practice. Because it's a wonderful example of the way in which we use the technology developed in the military context during the Second World War, basically. And we applied it to astronomy, to the study of the cosmos. And the interesting thing is that we use that on the ground. So the scope was to control, so we use this technology, you know, for military purposes. But then we use that in order to, or according to, let's say, our knowledge I mean, the physics behind it was already, or is already, a paradigm that was widely accepted, and it's in a sense a paradigm confirmation for that. But then it was used also to interpret and to interpret. It was used to build up with the detection of the CMB. It was used basically to infer that the Big Bang theory was the correct one, or the most correct one with respect to other models of the universe. But then, and I conclude because otherwise it's too long, my remark, but then how do we, so it's a bit complicated because I'm convinced that there is this link that you also highlighted. However, already, for example, William Herschel, long before GR or special theory of relativity, already William Herschel said that looking to the sky meant to look back into the past. So he already connected light, as a measure of, connected light and time, let's say, in his cosmological model. And so, how can we be completely really sure regarding, the assertion that the conception of time embedded in a certain cosmological model depends on the technology and so on and so forth that we use, and its expression, so to speak, of so it's a bit complicated or simplistic, let's say. And a final question, of course, you can also answer just to part of these remarks. You mentioned Leibniz, you mentioned Newton, you mentioned Christian tradition, you mentioned, but the problem of creation of the world is not just pertaining to the Christian tradition, but is pertaining also to the Platonic and Pythagorean tradition. And if we talk about Newton, if we talk about Leibniz or his master Weigel, we have to talk about Pythagorean tradition, and we have to talk about alchemy, and we have to talk about magic. Well, magic. I'm not really sure that the whole story regarding, the development of pre-modern cosmology and its eventual link or connection with modern one can be established just on the consideration of the Christian tradition, frankly speaking. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll answer the first one really quickly. I had in my longer, if I had gone on for another 20 minutes, I was going to get into the Timaeus and Plato. I think the answer to that question is, for me, the Christian tradition and the Platonic Pythagorean tradition are all part of one thing. And I did emphasize the theological part because when I always present this, I want to stress how important I think understanding the detailed theological arguments is to this. But those are theological arguments that go back to Platonic philosophy before Christianity in many ways, and the way in which there's a sort of, like you say, a story of creation there, and then they get emerged within Christianity. So it's for me, Christianity is kind of not special. It's just one of the categories that does come together Western philosophy in that way. It includes, it's Christianity's Athens meets Jerusalem. But so that's the Herschel comment I kind of want to come back to. That's really interesting. when you say that Kant, so you know clearly much more than I do at this point, or probably forever, about the details of what Kant's doing in this early period. So you mentioned that you read the passage I cited as directly referring to another contemporary of his, and I didn't hear the name. Is that right? Did I hear you right? If so, who is the person that you think that gesture towards those who practice the use of miracles and doing natural philosophy? Who is it that he's referring to?
Emanuel Swedenborg.
Swedenborg, okay.
But Laura is much more expert than I am on this.
Okay.
Or at least,
well, maybe we'll come back to you then too. And then I guess just another on these lines. So Swedenborg, Emanuel Swedenborg. Okay, I'm going to look into him. Anne Blair makes a big deal about the same. She uses Brucker, right? Brucker's History of Philosophy, which I like. I like using actors' categories to do these sorts of things. Brucker makes a very strong distinction between theosophists and Mosaic philosophers. Sees them as sort of related. They're Christian philosophers, but they are different. Those differences matter to me at one level, but my other thought is that at another level, they don't matter if what you're trying to show is the consistent or the persistent presence of this attempt to keep held together into one science, Christian understandings, Christian theological understandings, and or wider theosophic. It doesn't have to be per se, certainly not Orthodox Christian, but spiritualist, other kinds of religious, let's say this, religious understandings, with what we then distinguish as empirical natural science or mathematical principles, these sorts of things. So I guess I'm curious if you would want to push back on that. If I'm going to, seem like you were saying that distinction mattered, I'm not sure it does. So why do you think it does matter that we distinguish spiritualists, as you called them, theosophists, as Brucker calls them, other kinds of categories, from specifically Mosaic philosophers?
Well, I'm referring to the fact. Well, I'm not saying that. I'm talking with respect to the understanding of Kant's text, in the sense that Kant was highly influenced by Pietism.
Okay.
So it's not that Kant is an atheist or something like that.
Yeah.
However, for sure, he is highly critical of spiritualism, or spiritism, I would say. Anyway, so for him, for example, miracles or visions of that is just something that cannot really enter into the discussion of philosophy. It's something that must be left completely out of the philosophical discussion. Another thing is to talk about the problem of creation from the biblical standpoint, for example. Or consider what he wrote regarding the history of our planet in his 1754 essay. So he thinks that the reference to the deluge is that we find in the Bible. It's some sort of a mythological description of something that really happened. Or, for example, the type of, to date the beginning of the planet 6,000 years before is just wrong based on scientific evidence, he says. But still it's a way to say that it's a long time ago. So we never really find in Kant, at least it's not something that so he never takes seriously, never, both the Bible, what is written in the Bible, even if he says, okay, but this is something related to positive religion and can be respected, so one can believe or must believe in a sense. Sorry, so one can believe, and but one never has to confuse this with knowledge. He is, but is accepted, at least from a practical standpoint. It's accepted to believe in God, to believe in, but to keep them separated from scientific inquiry is a must, let's say. Whereas all that has to do with superstition or spiritualism for him is it's not even worth belief. So this is the difference.
Yeah, and I guess one of the thought, I don't know if other people have other questions, because it's very interesting, your comments, Sylvia, and then the Herschel one it's made me think that, like you say, trying to think about the nature of the changes that happen within what I'm calling Enlightenment cosmology that prepare the way for the kind of understandings we have today. I think the opening up of this role of history itself and time, therefore, which, as I emphasized, is present obviously in all kinds of ways before this, but is always struggling against this idea of this perfect eternity, this perfect, and that so when you describe Herschel saying, when you look into the sky, you're seeing the past. He's also saying you're seeing the result of processes that are happening in time and things like this, and that's how we should understand what the heavens are, and how that's, like you say, a step to then modern cosmology. I also think, looking back, what's interesting about that is it sort of says that one of the key things is this naturalist historical approach to everything, the way in which universal history, a lot of the places you go, if you want to find accounts before 1750, where they're laying out an account of the world as something other than just here's the perfection of the world, but a kind of historical account, or a developmental, a processual account, right? Account with steps in creation at some level, although even these will often be really saturated by the idea of the eternity guiding it, or so it's not a full creation ex nihilo, it's this way, but are in fact in universal histories. How are you going to understand the history of anything in a way in this period? You have to go to where the history starts, and for many that is an account of the origins of things, the primordial origins. The Nuremberg Chronicle is a fascinating example of this. It begins with this account of the world, First line is the first line of Latin Vulgate in Principio Creativita. I can't do the Latin off the top of my head, but you know what I mean. But by the end of that book, you have a very empirical account of the people of Nuremberg and the sort of detailed history of recent day Nuremberg in this way. I once encountered a book that was a history of the state of Montana in the United States that was published in 1894 by one of the first professors at the new University of Chicago, which was founded in 1890. First history professors, and they were writing, the title of it was The History of the State of Montana. It basically began with an account of what by then was sort of late 19th century geology and planetary history, but it too started with the formation of planet Earth, had all these accounts about the Columbian encounter and the Jesuits, even though none of them got to Montana. And then had this interesting moment, in fact, where it talked about the discovery by Europeans of the geysers and the things at Yosemite National Park now, you know, Old Faithful and these sort of natural geological wonders, and how philosophers, it was said, were brought in to analyze this. So this always for me is an example of how late these kinds of structures persist. And yet at the same time, as you say, they also become newly formulated as modern cosmology.
But I maybe I can just say this to clarify my point even more accurately, and also to add something to what you just said. Let's say before Kant, you had this strange mixture that we would call today geophysics or geology, meteorology, and cosmology, more better astronomy.
Right.
But Kant is really, one can explain it by looking at certain authors and other literature, but he was really a genius in this sense. So what he did in the mid of the 18th century, so he clearly distinguished the application of Newton's laws beyond the solar system and to the structure of the universe. He distinguished this with the discourse on geophysics, basically. So I can describe, according to Newtonian laws, the Earth and its relationship, and its place, let's say, within the solar system. But then if I want to talk about the Earth and its atmosphere, because there was, meteorology was already there in the 18th century, then I have to create a new discipline, and his new discipline was physical geography.
Yeah.
And he started teaching physical geography in the mid.
Yeah.
So Königsberg was one of the few universities in the world in which physical geography, So just to
and it's connected, right? It's connected to his lectures on anthropology too, which he's also very
but then these are later. But he starts by teaching physical geography, and he talks about earthquakes, the famous earthquake of Lisbon, and so on, and he always tries to avoid religious interpretations of these catastrophic events, for example.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to, I hope that you didn't hear me saying that Kant was in any way sympathetic to what I was describing. I was really the curious question, if Danielle knows more, you knows more. So the Swedenborg reference is a good one. I'm more interested in who he was referring to as the dominant tendency, even if he was mocking them, I think, it was a mocking kind of statement. And then to what extent in calling them the dominant tendency, that it is explaining an actual, if you think of it more synchronically, what was the debate available to a Kant? So, you know, I hope that what I say about Enlightenment cosmology will not disallow certain figures like maybe Kant from being recognized still as pioneers of sort of like parting a new path, but it's that I want to sort of put that pioneering step fully in context of what were other available options that were not taken by Kant, you know, in this way.
Yeah, but for example, you have Buffon.
Right.
So
right,
Buffon
which is later. I mean, well, I guess it comes out right at that same moment.
Yeah, well, I'm talking
right,
about
exactly.
the 18th century. So, if you mean, I think Swedenborg was extremely important. I mean, at that time,
Yeah.
it was very successful.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry for monopolizing the discussion, but something that interests me a lot. So.
Yeah. And when you said Huygens, it's Cosmotherios. That's what he has in his library.
He also read this, yes. So he refers to it in the Opus Posthumum, for example.
Yeah. Which I think for me is a very interesting text. And Huygens is a very interesting character because he's so important for Newton and for others, but he dies so young that it's sort of interesting. Young in the sense, not young for him, but young in the sense of the development of things. He's from another time, it seems, from that. But,
okay, so are there other questions? No. Okay, we thank our speaker again. And of course, thank you very much for being here today, to you, Jevi, and to all the people.
No, thank you. It was a great opportunity to start pulling this stuff together. So, yeah, thank you. And you've got my email here. If you want to reach out to me, I'd be glad to talk to you that way.
Thank you. Thank you all. Stay safe. Take care.
Yep, you too. Be well. Bye.
Bye. Bye.